As America and the West in general continues to decline in power, innovation, and intelligence, people often compare our situation to what happened in the film Idiocracy, a 2006 film by Mike Judge that's about a man who, due to government corruption and incompetence, is accidentally left frozen in stasis for 500 years, only to awaken a world where dysgenics has been hard at work, leaving everyone with the IQ of a cucumber. In particular, I hear a lot of people reference the beginning of the movie, where they kind of set up the situation. The narrator begins by saying, "As the 21st century began, human evolution was at a turning point. Natural selection, the process by which the strongest, the smartest, and the fastest reproduced in greater numbers than the rest, a process which once favored the noblest traits of man, now began to favor different traits. While most science fiction of the day predicted a future that was more civilized and more intelligent, all signs indicated that the human race was headed in the opposite direction. A dumbing down. How did this happen? Evolution does not make moral judgments. Evolution does not necessarily reward that which is good or beautiful. It simply rewards those who reproduce the most." The film then illustrates this dysgenic phenomenon by introducing the audience to a smart couple who keeps putting off having children and eventually never has children, and then compares that with less intelligent people who breed rapidly and have many children. The funny thing is, when this movie came out in 2006, this part of the film, a film that's clearly stating that intelligence is genetic and heritable, something that honest scientists would all agree with today, however, a majority of scientists will never say out loud today. This was completely non-controversial in 2006. Nobody boycotted this movie or tried to cancel Mike Judge. Nobody tried to make sure he never worked in Hollywood again for pointing out something that just a few years ago everyone agreed was simple, objective, observable reality. It's not that we were smarter and a more civil society back then than we are today, although that might be a little part of it. Mike Judge knew that in order to tell this truth, he had to be careful about how he did it. Simply put, there would have been riots outside of theaters, and he would have been run out of Hollywood unless he played to the egos of the gatekeepers. You see, what he did was he portrayed the stupid people as rural white Christians, the stupid breeders who were overloading the gene pool with bad genetics were rural white Christians. And the smart couple was a cosmopolitan Jewish couple. The cosmopolitan Jewish couple, they were the geniuses that just never got around to having children. And that really is the only reason this movie was allowed to include this concept. And it doesn't just stop there. Most people probably miss this, but while the film is mocking the white hillbillies having too many children, there's even a quick scene where a doctor explains that one of the stupid hillbillies injured his reproductive organs, but thanks to the medical advances of two Jewish doctors, he was able to have more children.
Thanks to recent advances in stem cell research and the fine work of doctors Krinsky and Altshuler.
Afterwards, the husband in the Jewish couple dies and leaves his wife barren with no children. And the decline in intelligence accelerates because all of the poor white trash have lots and lots of children. Now, of course, today this is a little infuriating for several reasons, but I'm not going to go into all of that. I am going to go on a limb, though, and say this was likely the only way Mike Judge would ever be able to illustrate this concept. Only way he would be able to put this out in a Hollywood film. But we also can't know for sure. The casting director was Mary Vernieu, who's been a casting director since the early 90s and is still working today. And for all we know, this is just all her doing. Either way, I think it's safe to say this concept would not have been allowed in the film had it not been cast specifically like this. Now, this is usually where people stop talking about Idiocracy because, quite frankly, it's a comedy. It's not the funniest movie ever made. Certainly not the best work of Mike Judge. And that first part really is probably the most important part of the movie. And I watched this movie probably around 2006, and I think I even told people at the time, don't even bother with the whole movie unless you're really bored. Just watch the first part. That's the funniest part. But now, with the separation of time, I rewatched it, and there's actually a few little gems peppered in there that I kind of missed. So let's just go over a few of what those are. So now that the film has established this premise that intelligence is genetic and heritable, and that the modern decadent world is no longer responding to evolutionary pressures that led to the civilization that we live in today, now that survival of the fittest has become kind of a thing of the past, and the world is being overrun by what Edward Dutton, for example, might describe as spiteful mutants. His channel is called The Jolly Heretic. He goes into more detail about that on his channel, but in brief, it's individuals who never would have survived in the same environment that our ancestors lived in. Because of the availability of resources and Western medicine, despite these genetic mutations, they survive. And not only do they survive, these mutations are compounded as they breed with other people with different genetic mutations. So they create offspring with more and more and more mutations. It's like if you were to get, think about different breeds of dogs. Breeders will breed different dogs to get different attributes from the parents. Well, imagine if a dog breeder simply got the runts of every litter, or just any dog with a birth defect, and bred it with another dog with a birth defect. Now, that's kind of an extreme example, but that's kind of what we're seeing in Western societies. My great something, I don't know how many great grandpas. He was a pioneer, and he had several children. And I think I've talked about this before. I was reading his journal, and in his journal he discusses the birth and death of several children, and he's very matter of fact about it. This winter little Kathy, she got the cough and died, and little Jimmy, he died of whatever. But the point being, nature used to just really cull a lot of the people being born. It wasn't like 100% success rate on people surviving to age 30. So really for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we've kind of had this natural eugenic effect on the population. And again, thanks to Western medicine and the availability of resources, that is no longer the case. You have lots of people who would not be able to fend for themselves, who might not have even survived to a reproductive age, who are now reproducing with possibly other people who that is also the case. And this is just kind of compounding. And again, this is exactly what's described in the preamble of Idiocracy. You have these people that would not be able to fend for themselves, reproducing more than the people who are actually producing in society. And in addition to that, you have medical advancements that are furthering the possibility that they will reproduce and create offspring with similar mutations. And again, this is something that wasn't all that controversial in 2006. Sure, Mike Judge had to show the people who were the so-called mutants as these white hillbillies in order to describe this scenario. But again, this isn't something... I remember watching this in 2006, and I wasn't like, that's a brilliant idea. It was just common sense. It was something that was just generally accepted. The only thing that was maybe groundbreaking was to really apply this on a large scale and say, hey, look, if this continues for any long period of time, we're going to have a dysgenic effect on society. And that's really what this movie's about. So anyway, back to the story. We're introduced to a completely average man, average 2006 man. In fact, He's been chosen for this new assignment for the military precisely because he is so average. The military is testing a human hibernation machine. The idea is that the military wants to be able to train super soldiers and then freeze them when they're at their physical and mental peak, so that if they ever need them, they can thaw them out and let them loose. This idea is kind of amusing because it's more realistic than really what you normally get in a movie like this about hibernation from Hollywood. Movies that like to promote military recruitment by pumping out films that focus on how honorable and sexy the military is. You'd expect a Hollywood film to say that, the reason why we need this hibernation machine is for space travel or something, exciting and groundbreaking. But Mike Judge, as he often does, writes a more realistic scenario where the military, just as the rest of our government, treats people like resources instead of humans. Why not keep a freezer full of killing machines that you can just warm up in the microwave when you need them and then throw them away when you're done? It's the American way. The man in charge of this project begins to show the other military men at the meeting that Joe is completely average. There's even a chart with his IQ and the bell curve where Joe seems to score a perfect 100. He's average in every way. They have also found a female subject to participate in the experiment, but instead of an average Joe enlisted men, in 2006, it might be because it wasn't as common to have women in the military, but the project leader instead decides to choose a prostitute by the name of Rita in exchange for dropping some charges and making a deal with her pimp named Upgrade. The experiment is supposed to keep Joe and Rita frozen in a coffin-like pod for 1 year, after which they'll be thawed out, and if the experiment works, they're confident they can store humans indefinitely in this frozen state. But, of course, there wouldn't be a movie if that's all that happened. The officer in charge of the super-secret experiment is arrested on prostitution and human trafficking charges. Not too far from the truth, I would say. The base is closed and demolished to make room for a Fuddruckers, and the coffins holding the sleeping Rita and Joe are put in a dump where they're forgotten. Several years go by, and every year, Americans get stupider and stupider and stupider, until 500 years later, a massive trash avalanche uncovers the coffins and wakes up Joe and Rita from their slumber. Joe's coffin is propelled into a living pod of a man watching television. The show that he's watching is simply called Ow My Balls, and it's just shot after shot of a man injuring his balls. The man watching this show just kind of laughs stupidly while he stuffs food from a bucket into his face and sits on a recliner with a toilet built into it. He's so preoccupied by the low IQ humor on his television screen, he hasn't even bothered to turn around and look and see what all the noise was when the coffin came smashing through his wall. Joe gets out of the coffin and he's confused. He asks the man where he is, but the man reacts violently and throws him out of the window for interrupting his television show. Joe wanders the streets of this dystopian nightmare where the year is now 2505. Everyone is a moron. The world is covered in corporate logos. Signs of incompetence are everywhere. He goes to a hospital for help. The woman working at the hospital is just as stupid as everyone he's encountered on the street. In fact, she's so dumb, she doesn't seem to even possess the ability to talk. She just listens to him describe his problem. And in front of her, she's got a keyboard that's been designed kind of like a Fisher-Price toy, so that all she has to do is push a simple symbol on the keyboard that remotely aligns with what he says is wrong with him. And the AI takes care of the rest. Once again, I can tell you this is kind of reality. This is the direction that computers are going in. I remember when I was first using computers as a child, having to write code to get your computer to do anything. And not that I think that's an ideal, but that you had to have technical knowledge in order to get computers to act, to do anything. And to go from that already to touchscreens that literal chimpanzees can operate. Chimpanzees can operate Instagram, which really does kind of illustrate, even now, the public getting dumbed down and technology accommodating this loss of intelligence in the public. In this dystopian future, everything seems to be automated, run by some kind of AI, and corporate logos are everywhere. Capitalism has finally produced the multicultural pasture for the herds of mindless consumers that it always aspired to create. Consumers that are literally just barely smart enough to push the buttons, pull the levers, and buy the products to stay alive. Joe finally realizes that something's gone horribly wrong. He hasn't just been asleep for 1 year. He finally realizes it's been 500 years, and he's horrified by this dystopian future. Just as he realizes this, Joe's doctor discovers that Joe doesn't have the tattoo that apparently everyone is supposed to have, that the tattoo that brands them like cattle and also allows them to operate within this dystopia. Joe is arrested and forced to get a tattoo and become one of the cattle. After receiving his brand or his tattoo, they have him take an aptitude test before hauling him off to prison. Once Joe's in the prison, however, he realizes everyone's so stupid that the prison guards are so dumb, he can just talk his way out of prison and they let him go. And by the time the AI discovers that something's wrong, it's already too late and he's escaped. While on the run, Joe finds out that there's a time machine. So he goes and finds Rita, the other person that was frozen for 500 years, and he tells her what's happened, and they go to try to find the time machine. But before they can get to the time machine, Joe is arrested in Costco and taken into custody because, as it turns out, when he took the aptitude test, when they were bringing him into prison, he scored the highest IQ score that they had ever seen. He's technically the smartest person in the world now, and the president wants to see him. We now meet the president, and once again, obviously, demographics here are not an accident. The president decides to make Joe a member of his cabinet. He's going to be Secretary of Interior. So he takes him to the Capitol building that resembles a reality TV show set. So basically exactly the same as today, except for more strobe lights. And President Camacho tells the people that Joe, with his super high IQ, will fix all of the problems that they're having. There's a drought. The crops have been dying and they don't know why. And there's dust storms. And so now they've got this super genius. He's going to fix all of the problems. Joe, of course, doesn't know anything about farming. He's a little intimidated by having to solve all of the nation's problems, but he quickly discovers that the crops are dying because the largest corporation in this version of America, Brondo, an energy drink manufacturer, long ago decided that water was a threat to their profits. So they bought the FDA and the FCC, and they convinced people to replace water for their energy drink, Brondo, for everything, including watering crops. And the salts in the drink slowly built up in the soil, and it started killing off the crops. So the farmers are literally watering their crops with energy drink, and all they have to do, Joe decides, is switch back to water. So Joe gets them to start watering plants with water again. But now there's another problem. Think of all the corporate monopolies we have right now that they just go unchecked, that don't get broken up like AT&T did. Companies like Google, for example, but there are several companies that have just become these mega corporations. Companies like Apple. This too big to fail style of capitalism that's been going on in our country for decades. Imagine that keeps going for 500 years, which is what's happened in this dystopian future. So in this dystopian future, Brondo is the company that has essentially devoured all of the smaller companies, and now half the country works for Brondo. And when the stock price begins to plummet because Brondo is now in competition with water again, unemployment skyrockets because Brondo is run by an AI. And the AI sees that the stock price is going down, so it just automatically lays off half of their workforce. So now essentially a quarter of the country is unemployed overnight. And when the stupid people put together that what caused this, what triggered this layoff, was Joe telling them to use water on plants instead of Brondo, they sentence him to a gladiator-like public execution in a giant arena with monster trucks. Now, this is something I think a lot of us can relate to. Obviously not the giant arena and monster trucks, but history is full of examples where societies persecute and often execute their geniuses. All Joe was trying to do was to save them from famine, save them from their own stupidity, save them from extinction, and they've decided to repay him with a public execution. Fortunately, because everyone trying to kill Joe is so stupid, he manages to survive longer than probably most people they've sent to this arena, and also grabs a microphone and says what I think many of us probably think on a regular basis these days. He says, "Do you really want to live in a world where you blow up the one person that's trying to help you?" And what happens next is maddeningly predictable. Again, we see this all the time, even now. In fact, there's probably not a single person on the right that's listening to this right now that hasn't at least for a moment had to stop and wonder if it's even worth trying to save the people that seem content to march directly to extinction, just like the crowd in this movie is hell-bent on doing. But luckily, before the legions of NPCs can put to death the one man that's trying to save them, Rita manages to hijack the control room and broadcasts a video of crops that are now growing in the fields because they've been using water instead of Brondo, which calms the crowd down. But you see, it's not until the TV screens told Planet NPC that Joe's plan to water the crops with water was working that they believed it. And again, this is just a reality that we see today. This is just how NPCs operate. They go with the crowd. They do what the automated machines tell them to do, what the mega corporations tell them to do, what the politicians tell them to do. It's not until the pretty people on TV tell them to think differently that they update their programming. So you see, the future is not going to be like Idiocracy. We're already living in it. And many of the people listening and watching this right now are just like Joe in one way or another, screaming in the faces of NPCs that you need to stop watering your crops with Brondo if you don't want to go extinct. For BlackPilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share. If you want to support my work, you can grab a copy of my book. Link is in the description. You can send crypto to one of the addresses below or become a patron at patreon.com/blackpilled or subscribestar/blackpilled.